Welcome everyone to our penultimate lecture. And this week we are jumping from the end of the 1960s and the social revolutions and revolts that we have in Europe, West and East, to another turning point as we're approaching towards the end of the 20th century, which is in fact, the end of our survey of Europe in the 20th century. And this event is no other than the collapse of the USSR, the fall of communism in Europe, and the wide-ranging repercussions that this had, not only for the international system, but for the divisions within the European continent itself. And we spoke last week about, the divisions between Eastern and Western Europe in the end of the 1960s. Now, what I will do in this lecture is to give you a sense of how and why it is that the USSR collapses, what goes on in the USSR, and most importantly, I want to offer a wide-ranging overview of the transitions that we have in different parts of Europe, from communism to the existing setup. One might call it capitalist democracy, liberal democracy, So yes, fasten your seatbelts. There will be some videos here, and the aim of this lecture, and I really look forward to the discussion and the presentation on the Berlin Wall, is to have a wider, so to get a sense of how it is that Europe becomes pretty much close to the Europe we understand now, and this is the story of the late 80s and early 90s. How do I begin? Let me start by talking a bit about Russia. And I think I think next year there is a module option on Russian politics and Russian history, so you can, delve further into it. In a nutshell, the story is that Stalin dies mid 50s. And then after that, there is a process in Russia, and we are now approaching the 1960s, of the so-called de-Stalinization, the end of the cult of personality, and a period where Russia tries to boost internal consumption and show to the West and the world that they're open. And there's a period of relative liberalization. This is all captured by the term THAW, THAW, which is associated with a leader who's not present in this PowerPoint, Nikita Khrushchev. And that is the story of the 1960s. Mid-50s to mid-60s, to be more precise. After that, what we have in Russia is a change of arms. There is how to put it in a simpler term, a kind of a tightening of the rule, if you will, associated with the rule of Leonid Brezhnev, who we find in this PowerPoint. And this is a period known as stagnation. Now, the most important thing to note with regards to stagnation is that Russian economy stalls, and there is widespread dissatisfaction within Russia and within the countries of the socialist bloc. And last week we talked about, we saw the events in late 60s in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. So there's a wide array of dissatisfaction that's being built within the socialist camp. Now, what happens in the early 1980s, and this is an important thing to note with regards to Russian political life. There is a period of instability. Brezhnev dies, and then we have old aging leaders who can't really maintain a grip on the party and on society. This is the story of Andropov and Chernenko. You don't really have to remember the names, just the wider story here is that we have in the early 80s in Russia a story of political instability that builds on a period of economic stagnation. And what emerges from that story of political instability is a leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, the final person in my PowerPoint, who comes up with the story he kind of rises through the ranks of the Communist Party, and he has a reformist vision of what the Soviet Union should be or become in order to survive in a changing environment. And let me give you a sense now of how Gorbachev is being, how the news of a change of leadership in Russia are being kind of diluted in a place far from Europe, America. But it gives you a sense because we are, let's not forget, on the kind of final section or final chapter of the Cold War here.
Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
The transitional period, it would seem, is over. Another Soviet leader who was too old and too sick when he took power to hold on to it has died. And now a 54-year-old has taken over, someone who, theoretically at least, will be around for a generation. Get used to the name, Mikhail Gorbachev. According to at least normal life expectancy, Gorbachev should have plenty of time to put his mark on Soviet affairs. And take...
Now, what's interesting here is that Gorbachev, as we all know, didn't really live for a generation. However, life expectancy-wise, a few days ago, he turned 90. So he's still alive, giving interviews, but he's someone whose grip on Russia and his rule kind of lasted only 5 years, and we'll see the dramatic events that led to that. Now, Gorbachev is associated. To put it simply, Gorbachev and the people around him saw that if the Soviet Union was to survive, there needed to be some kind of a reform agenda. And he coined the term perestroika, explaining this reform agenda. Perestroika means rebuilding, restructuring. And glasnost, another concept associated with Gorbachev's kind of reformist vision, means openness. What's interesting to note here is that, if I were to ask you if we're in class, which is the longest serving communist regime in the world, it is China. So what happens in Russia, the kinds of the awakening to reforms, openness to international trade, openness to the West, in a way, the idea that if Russia is to survive, it has to switch on towards some kind of degree of a capitalist system. This is something that the Chinese understand quite well in this particular period. And the China that we know today, the workshop of the world, the capitalist state with a communist veneer, is actually pretty much the outcome of the reforms initiated at a similar time frame by another leader, Deng Xiaoping. So the reason I put this here, this is of course about Europe, not about the world, but it's to show you that what Gorbachev and what Russia tries to do at the time is part of a wider, as it were, agenda that communist part of a wider wave where communist movements try and find ways to open their economies, to open themselves to capitalism in order to survive in a changing world. However, Russia faces different challenges than China. There's limited role to international trade and foreign investment in Russia. The reforms that Gorbachev initiates are mainly top-down reforms. Perestroika, in comparison to China, comes with more political freedoms. And another difference is that the Soviet state faces at the time more centrifugal pressures. By this, from its constituent elements. By this, I mean that Soviet state was a much more heterogeneous state, comprised of different nationalities. much more so than the Chinese state. Not that the Chinese state is not heterogeneous, but it's important to note that Russia at the time doesn't consist only of what we understand today as Russia. It is an assortment of all sorts of different nationalities, different mini Soviet states, as it were, not only in Eastern Europe, but also on the other side, on the other part of Asia. And I will get there later. Now, as Gorbachev and his regime tries to initiate this reform agenda, in a nutshell, when you think of perestroika, think of making it so that Russian society acquires more freedoms and also at the same time is able to trade more with the West. Certain things are, even in the, discussions that might be privatized. So some kind of opening towards the capitalist West. So at the same time that this is going on, a landmark event that comes in right a year after the initiation of this policy that it's symbolic, but it actually has important repercussions and effects across Europe and in the neighboring Russian mini-states, is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. It is an extraordinary event. A nuclear plant in what now is Ukraine, pretty much because of years of mismanagement and underinvestment, is leaking. It's leaking radioactive material, and obviously this raises alarm across Europe. There's an effort from Russia first, then Europe and America to contain this. What is important here to note is the way the Russian state and the Russian central government manages this disaster shows to the world pretty much how rotten the Russian state system is. And many are feeling that no matter what kind of reforms Gorbachev is really pushing, it might be difficult for the Soviet state to recover. It's a fascinating story, the Chernobyl story. There was a documentary a couple of years ago, a big one on this. I do urge you to look this up and look more on this, and we can discuss that in the tutorial. Now, we are still at the Cold War moment, and most importantly, there is no other place in Europe that symbolizes the divisions of the Cold War, the clash of ideologies between the Western world and the Soviet world, than Germany, and more importantly, than Berlin. And 1987, a year after the Chernobyl disaster, Ronald Reagan issues his famous words sitting in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin.
Themselves may in a limited way be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state? Or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
This is a historic moment. I left this playing because it's interesting to see how the Americans see the Gorbachev experiment. And here, after following this, Reagan will issue,
Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
These are the famous words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But it's interesting to note how the Americans at the time and the Western Europeans perceive what Gorbachev is trying to do in Russia. Now, this takes us to Germany. What is happening from the 70s onwards is that the Western German authorities are pursuing a policy that has been called as German Ostpolitik, the East policy of Germany, Western Germany, which is to say that the Western component of the country, Helmut Kohl is the chancellor, the key political forces are Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, depending, pretty much a similar setup to what we have today in Germany. Now, the western part of Germany normalizes relations with the East German puppet state, and they and instead of going through, pushing forward for the division, there is a concerted approach that West German policymakers have in keeping their East German counterparts, in keeping in discussion with their East German counterparts. And this also plays a key role, this concerted effort from the West German state in the reunification later, plays in laying the ground for the reunification. So in other words, we don't have in Germany two regimes that are at loggerheads with one another and they're threatening to annihilate one another, as for instance we had some years ago in between South and North Korea. There is an effort from West Germany, as there is an effort from South Korea now. Interestingly, it's really interesting to see this parallel anyway, to kind of maintain relations at the diplomatic level with East Germany. And what we find in 1987, what we see in this picture, same year that Reagan issues this speech from Berlin, is that the Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Western Germany, and Honecker, the communist leader of East Germany, they meet, they have discussions. Now, what I want to do now is kind of end this segment here. Hopefully I've given you a sense of what is at stake in Russia, how does the Western world respond, and the centrality of the German question. Germany and Berlin exemplifies all the divisions of the Cold War at the time. And when I come back for the second segment, which will be slightly longer, I warn you, I will take you through the different kinds of transitions we have in Eastern Europe. And here in the map we see pretty much a number of interesting things. First we have the old Soviet Union borders, the Eastern European boundaries, and there we see what happens in a matter of not more than 1-2 years. These many states are created, or not created, are proclaiming their independence from the Soviet yoke. This is a moment equivalent to what happens, if you remember, in our first or second lecture after the First World War, in terms of the genesis, the independence of new nation states. So I will quickly guide you through as many transitions as possible in the second segment.